Okay, welcome back to part 2 of this video. This is Introduction to First Year Macroeconomics. And this video will maybe be a little more fun than the previous one. So to get us all starting on thinking about, what is this thing macroeconomics? In the last one we kind of got a little heavy with social organization and customs and traditions and how that forms economy. In this one, let's sort of have a little bit of fun. And so what I would like to do is let's work through a little exercise of thinking about how economic growth occurs, but using squirrels as the examples. So for those of you who don't know, probably nobody, right? But that's a squirrel down there, right? So this time of year, it's early winter. When I'm recording this, squirrels are everywhere, sort of running around trying to gather up food for the winter. Then they hibernate. Going back to our economic questions from that we learned about in the last video, what to produce, how to produce, for whom to produce. Okay, so from the squirrel's perspective, how to do this, right? They've got to stay alive just like we do. They need basic things to keep them warm. They need shelter. They need food, not clothes really, but hair, right? Fur. So how does this work for them? Well, what to produce? They got to produce food in the form of nuts, right? And they've got to produce a hole of some sort, usually in a tree or something like that, as shelter or a nest. Okay, well, then how are they going to produce those things? Well, we know how they do that, right? They run around on the ground, they put the nuts into their mouth, right? And when they fall from the trees, and then they bring those back to the house. So it's the question of how to produce, pretty straightforward. The question of what to produce, pretty straightforward. How to produce the hole of shelter? Well, either you dig a hole in the side of a dead tree, or you gather up some leaves and branches and you make a nest out of it using your mouth again, right? Okay, so pretty basic economic questions. For whom to produce? Well, they're going to gather. They're not going to gather those nuts for the benefit of society. They're not going to gather those nuts to sell them in the marketplace. They're not going to gather those nuts to barter them to other people. They're not going to gather nuts for the good of the king squirrel. Okay, they're going to gather them for themselves and maybe their children. Okay, so for whom to produce? For me, right? Okay, I mean not me literally. You get the idea, right? Okay, so of course in that very simple economic system, there's never going to be any economic growth ever. Right, and indeed, the squirrels. This is what they do every year. Every year in the fall, they run around and gather up nuts, and then over the winter time, they eat those nuts, and then the springtime, they start the cycle all over again. There's no unemployment for the squirrels. Okay, unemployed squirrel is a dead squirrel. There's no inflation for the squirrels. Price of the nut is expressed in what we're going to call real terms. That doesn't really change. The only thing that really affects it is how many nuts fell from the tree this year. Okay, so it's a pretty stagnant, non-changing economy. Okay, but let's imagine a scenario where things go differently. Okay, so let's imagine that this winter, which is it's beginning here, right? Or if you're watching this in spring or wherever, next winter, right? The next winter that'll occur, let's say maybe instead of the squirrels sleeping, right? They're going to take a class in basket weaving. Okay, so yeah. Now, economists call that idea investment, right? So the idea that the squirrel's going to learn how to produce the things that they produce, nuts, more effectively in the future by eating nuts today, we call that investment spending in economics. So when economists talk about investment, they're not talking about you buying stock in General Motors or bond issues or anything like that. Nope, that is not what economists mean by investment. And it's not just me saying this, right? So when you see data, investment spending was up last quarter. It does not mean people buying stocks or things like that. No, it means this, right? Okay. That is spending time or resources on learning how to produce better in the future. This is investment. Okay. Investment spending also includes production and process, which you could argue you couldn't argue it is this, okay? So let's say our squirrels invest, right, in the sense that we're talking about here. What if the squirrel taking a basket weaving class learns how to make a basket that can go on its back? like that one there. Okay, that one stuffs. It's not going to gather any nuts, but imagine that it's still alive. Okay, so how is this going to change our questions from before? Well, how to produce. When the nuts fall, put nut in the mouth and in backpack and bring back to hole. Okay, so the production process has gotten marginally more sophisticated as a result of what? The investment. Okay. All right, now check it out. Now the squirrel has more nuts with less work. So she's richer in what we call real terms. That is, got more stuff, right? Can gather more nuts in less time. This is economic growth. Okay, this is what it means for an economy to grow. More stuff, less work. Okay. We call that productivity, specifically gains in productivity. So to some extent, gains in productivity synonymous with gains in economic growth. Yes, to a fairly significant extent, the two terms are not synonymous, but they do certainly go hand in hand. Okay, and indeed, gains in productivity are a requisite for real economic growth. Let's get back to our story and sort of thinking how these macroeconomies work, right? So far we've got the idea that squirrels can, they store up nuts, which you call in savings. They use up those nuts over the winter, but they're thinking of better ways of doing nut gathering next year. We call that investment. So from where did the investment come? The investment came from the real savings capacity. Indeed, the two things were the same thing, right? The things that we used up when we were thinking about better ways to do things, we were using up the savings in the form of investment. Okay, that's going to be an important point. Remember, if you can remember that, you're a long way to understanding sort of how macroeconomies function. All right, but back to our story. Now that this squirrel has become more productive, has more real material wealth, what other problems might they have? So it's a big pile. So pause this and think what problems might they have? All right. Maybe other squirrels don't have enough nuts to survive. So one squirrel's so good at gathering nuts up that there's no extra nuts left around for other squirrels. Well, that's resource depletion. See that in modern societies. That's the story right there. Okay. Maybe there's not enough nuts for every squirrel to go out gathering. So in other words, other squirrels are like, forget it, I'm not going because there's no nuts out there. Well, we call that unemployment. Okay. Maybe our one squirrel has to worry about theft, right? Because the other squirrels are like, there's no nuts left. We're going to go take that squirrel's nuts. Okay, now we've got a demand for protection or demand for property rights. All economic growth brings increased wealth, right? But it also brings change, always, always, always. And that change requires us to think about how we're going to deal with the effects of those changes. Are we going to make it okay for the one squirrel to have all the nuts? Are we going to develop protective services that squirrel has to pay for? Are we going to limit the number of nuts that you can gather? Okay. These are all social questions that are going to determine what the economy looks like going forward. And it's going to be a conversation that these squirrels are going to have. So let's say that our productive squirrel is concerned about theft. And so they're sitting on this giant pile of nuts and they think, oh my gosh, these other squirrels, they're out of luck. They're going to come and steal these nuts. Well, maybe that squirrel goes out and finds the biggest, baddest squirrel they can find and says, hey, you just come over here, just stop anybody from taking these nuts away, and you can have half of them, right? So that's all you have to do. You don't have to gather nuts. You just sit here, right? Keep other people from eating these nuts. Okay, well, we've just created a job, right? Our first squirrel is a job creator, and the job they've created is police squirrel or cop squirrel, if you like. Okay. So here's another part of that change, right? As economies grow and develop, what starts to happen is that as people become better at existing jobs, there's fewer of those jobs needed, right? Initially, every squirrel needs to gather their own nuts. But once one squirrel becomes good enough to gather nuts for two, there's now the possibility of a second job coming into existence. Job couldn't have existed before, right? If everybody can only gather enough nuts just to survive, then nobody can do anything but gather nuts. But once one of the squirrels is good enough at gathering nuts for two, they can give some of those nuts to another squirrel in exchange for some labor services. Okay, in this case, protection. Now we have, in our little squirrel society, we have two jobs, as I say, nut gatherer, nut... All right, so the economic growth has caused both unemployment, that's right, there are less nut gatherers are needed, and employment. Okay, new job is created. Right, so economic growth, advances productivity also create jobs and destroy jobs. Okay, now we call this process of creating different types of jobs or different people in society doing different sorts of tasks a division of labor. And that's a word you'll hear from time to time. It's this cornerstone of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, a very famous book on economics in the 18th century. So let's run this little story again. Let's say that both our squirrels now, our cop squirrel and our gatherer squirrel, again spend winter at school. So they're going to try to both boost their productivity. What do you think might happen? So cop squirrel maybe learns how to guard the nuts more effectively, can guard more, and maybe the gatherer squirrel learns how to create automated or mechanized nut gathering machines. So this just shakes the tree and all the nuts flow into a basket. What sort of things might happen next? What other jobs do you see being created or destroyed? What problems might this society have to face? Do you think that some of the nut gathering squirrels might get upset about our squirrel that's becoming more and more productive? What about the cop squirrel? Do you think that maybe other squirrels would feel some animosity towards that individual, just sort of keeping all the other squirrels away from these nuts? I think if you spend a few minutes talking through this story with maybe a friend or two, maybe you can get them to sit and watch a short video, talk about it a little bit. I think what you're going to find is you're going to start seeing that many of the discussions and conflicts that we have in our society become pretty clear what's going on and why that is. Anyway, I think that's enough for now. I hope you enjoyed it. This is what economics is all about, and this is particularly what macroeconomics is about. Now, if you're thinking, oh my gosh, I thought there's going to be a lot of like math and stuff like that. Yeah, there is, right? Because we're gonna have to measure all this stuff eventually. But for now, just enjoy thinking about the squirrels. Okay, thanks very much. See you next time. Bye.